Great. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I think, building on what Tom and Rebecca have said, including some observations from work that I've been doing with my friend Phil Cook at Duke and John Gurion at Northwestern. And I think there's one overarching theme or argument to my talk, which is that we live in a fallen world. That's basically all I have. We could just move to questions and answers now, or I could elaborate. The specific cases that I want to talk through are seeing how the policy conversations actually and benefit cost analysis actually gets used out in the wild. Realizing how difficult it is to explain even things that are very basic to people in this room, like the difference between failing to reject the null hypothesis and accepting the null hypothesis, the great difficulty of explaining what is a good example of a research design versus not a good example within a research design class, and the living in Chicago, the growing appreciation, even I can learn, given enough time, that politics turn out to be very political. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk a little bit about thinking about, what the IOM is going to do. You want to produce a study that's actually going to make the world a better place, make the real world a better place. And I thought about the great value in thinking about what we're doing here on the program evaluation side and on the back end for the rest of the benefit cost analysis, to do what engineers call human error tolerant design. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. But this is not to say that the policy environment never uses our research well, but it is to say that there are lots and lots of examples where the sort of thing that we do in good faith turns out to translate to something that is not socially helpful. And I think it really does, I think, have the potential to change the way we think about what we do and what this IOM workshop would describe as the standards if you recognize that potential for human error. So let me give you one example for starters, something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. Many of you are familiar with the federally funded National Head Start Impact Study. Many years ago, the federal government sponsored a large-scale randomized controlled trial. Joe Klein, writing a column in Time magazine in 2011, argued the evidence is indisputable that Head Start simply does not work. And as if that were not enough to make his point, he said that continuing to funding Head Start is criminal, every bit as outrageous as tax breaks for oil companies. Now, my mom, when we moved to Germany, from Germany to the United States, when I was 3, my mom learned how to speak English reading Time magazine. So this was really quite a powerful experience for me to see that Time magazine has certified Head Start as equivalent to tax breaks for oil companies. Ron Haskins at Brookings talks about how little you get for investments in Head Start. Doug Besheroff wrote something called Head Start's Broken Promise. And so with this as the commentariat take on the results of the Head Start experiment, you would think, wow, this is a terrible program. I can't wait to go read the Head Start impact study and see the precisely estimated benefit cost ratio that rules out the idea that this would actually pass a benefit cost test. This is actually what you do see when you go to the Head Start impact study. I think that these are the results for the 3-year-olds. These are the the reading and language test score results. The height of each red bar here is the point estimate. And then you can see the 95% confidence interval. And so the thing that has lots of people disconcerted is that it is not a super precise randomized experiment. It was analyzed by Westat separately for the 3 and the 4-year-olds. I'm just reproducing what Westat did. Westat says that HHS asked them to do this. And you can see that the 95% confidence intervals and 2 of the 4 things here include 0, which the real world interprets as a 0. Now, there's a different way to think about this, which is how big would the effect need to be in order for Head Start to pass a benefit cost test. So Deborah Phillips, many years ago, she and I wrote an NBR working paper that said we think our best defensible guess is that the impact from Head Start on these standardized test scores would need to be about 1/10 of a standard deviation for the intervention to pass a benefit cost test. That's the lower horizontal bar. If you wanted to be very conservative, as we argue in our paper, you would use a quarter standard deviation. It doesn't matter how we get, but the key point to this is that if you look at the confidence intervals around these Head Start impact estimates, certainly if you use the 0.1 best guess estimate for what the intervention would need to achieve to pass a benefit cost test, does Head Start pass a benefit cost test? You can't say from this experiment. Now, how could we solve this problem? One possible solution is to educate the consumers of the research that we carry out. I have been trying to do this with the Head Start Impact Study. We've written several different papers now, and it is not as easy. I'm sure that I'm not as persuasive as I would like, but it's also the case that it turns out to be very difficult to do that. Even, you're seeing it's not just Time Magazine reporters who are having trouble grasping these ideas, but also the DC, these are the best think tanks in DC who are issuing reports that don't understand some of these basic issues. During the pre-call for this panel, Rebecca had an interesting proposal, which is to ban asterisks. So let me just give you an example of what that means. I'm highly sympathetic to this because Phil Cook and I wrote something about gun research many years ago for JPAM, and we basically endorsed the Rebecca proposal. Let me give you an example of this. Suppose that I had an intervention that, let's say, reduced crime, and it cost a nickel a kid, and I did an RCT that was not super large. So it cost a nickel a kid, and if you take the point estimate seriously, the estimated value per kid would be $1 million per kid, but the p-value is 0.11. Okay? Who in this, so that's an extreme example, but no one in this room, as someone who would actually live in the real world and want policies that make the world a better place enacted, would say we shouldn't take a gamble on this program since the p-value is 0.11, which I think raises this question about what the loss function is for using benefit cost analyses for. This is not new to the people, most of the people in this room, but this is going to be a very important thing for this group to think about if we're producing things that are going to be used in the real world. Here's a different sort of strategy for dealing with this, which is to anticipate the difficulty of policymakers and the people, the research consumers, to think about our estimates in the most socially productive way, and don't do underpowered experiments, right? So what we do now is we write grant proposals for federal agencies, and we provide a lot of details about our power calculations, and then we give a number. My MDE is 0.23. And there's no standard for how to think about whether 0.23 is big or small. There's Cohen's canon or whatever it is, but however you, the 0.2 being, anyway. There's a different sort of standard that benefit cost analysis would imply, which is we should run experiments on important policies where we have adequate power to tell whether it passes a benefit cost test, that is, whether the benefit cost ratio is 1. Let me give you one other example, and then I'll close. There is another real-world example that I think builds on what Tom was just talking about, and I think is, I don't know what the right thing to do here is, but I want to raise this as a very difficult question for this group to wrestle with, which is the great difficulty for research consumers to adjudicate what is a good and bad study within a given research design class. So in Illinois recently, we had a big debate about what we should do for concealed carry regulations in the state. And the research is not helpful at all, I think it's fair to say, in informing the policy debates. I think one of the things that would also be useful for this group to think more about is whether, I think one of the ways that the research field has tried to solve that problem is to try and create what you might call stamp of approval mechanisms. And so Tom talked several times about the What Works Clearinghouse. And at least in the little subset of policy where I spend a lot of time thinking, it doesn't feel like these different stamp of approval mechanisms are necessarily doing exactly what we want them to do, partly because there's variability across what they count. But I think it would be useful for this group to reflect more generally on whether, if suppose that you could get every stamp of approval mechanism to cohere on a given standard, whether that would still be sufficient to solve this problem. Because I think there is another big problem sitting in the background here, which is for a lot of the people who use benefit cost analyses on really important real world policy questions, the fact that research findings are all over the place within a design class is a feature, not a bug. That is to say that it is very helpful for policymakers and advocacy organizations who go into an issue knowing what they want the answer to be able to look at a broad class of research studies and say, your diff and diff says A, my diff and diff says opposite of A, research is mixed, now let's throw aside the whole enterprise and move on to something else. Here again, you could try and educate consumers, you could try and standardize and strengthen the stamp of approval mechanisms. I don't know, I honestly don't know if that would solve the problem. I think the question that I wanted to pose to this IOM group is, it really is a question because I don't know what the right answer to this is, which is whether the only way you're going to avert bad behavior in the real world is to draw very bright lines for research design quality. That is one way, that is a different way to solve this problem. So for instance, the MIT Poverty Lab, they do a lot of very important policy experiments in the developing country context. They have made a strategic decision to draw, these are Esther Duflo knows a very good difference in difference study from an RCT, but Esther and the Poverty Lab people have made a strategic real-world decision that they're going to draw a bright line at RCTs so they do not need to litigate what is a good diff and diff out in the real world. There is a trade-off associated with that decision, right? As I'm sure the Poverty Lab people, as everybody here would, and this was highlighted by Tom's talk, which is you're throwing away good information from the good non-RCT, non-RD studies. Now, if we lived in a world in which policy was made by our mostly benevolent dictator Tom Cook, or if we lived in a world in which every state and every city had a Steve Oce, you might think about how to do this in one way, and then you would start to go down Tom Cook's way of thinking about, let's think about the very particular constellation of conditions under which a study within a given design class is more likely to be able to give us an unbiased impact estimate. Sadly, we do not live in a world in which Tom is our mostly benevolent dictator or in which every state and city across the country has a Steve Oce. And so I think that pricing in some of these user errors on the back end, I think, would be something that would be very useful for the IOM group to think about moving forward. And I even thought that one of the exercises that might be useful for this group is to do sort of after-action reports where you would go through and review the policy debates and highlight examples where you thought benefit cost analysis was used in an important policy debate in a particularly cringe-inducing way to your group, and then try and reverse engineer that and think about whether there was anything that the research community could have done in advance to reduce the risk of that happening and tie the hands of the policy making process to some degree. So thank you very much.